Great.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Hello, YouTube. I think we should be on over there. We'll start the recording in this room, record to the cloud. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our final Water, Wetlands, and Watershed seminar for spring 2022. We are very lucky today to have Dr. Carrie Adams presenting for us for our last seminar of the semester. Just one quick announcement before we get going. So for everyone who's enrolled for a credit, whether you are attending live or watching the recording, there's the link to the evaluations. I know this is just a seminar where you come and you write a single, page abstract or a write-up. But for us, it's a chance to hear some feedback about how it's going. Did the virtual hybrid system work okay for you? What did you think about the selection of speaker topics? And anyway, it's a chance for you to evaluate the course. And it's also a chance for us to show the people who let us teach it that indeed there are students watching the courses, they have some interest or, at least some feedback for us. So we'd like the participation in the evals to, exceed 50%. And that can be hard for a seminar course. And we can't give you any extra credit. So just please, if you are able to muster the gusto, please do the course evaluations. All right, now speaking of gusto, we're going to introduce Dr. Adams. So Dr. Carrie Adams is an associate professor at the University of Florida here. She has her bachelor's in environmental resources management and master's in ecology from Penn State. That's the Lions, right? Is that the Lions? Yes,
definitely.
The Lions. And her PhD in water resources from the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on ecological restoration of wetland plant communities. And in particular, taking what we know from experimental studies all the way up to the scale that can be useful for natural resource managers. She serves on the editorial board of the journal Ecological Restoration and is past chair of the Women in Wetlands section of the Society of Wetland Scientists. So thank you, Dr. Adams. It's great to have you here. And the floor is yours.
Thanks, David. I share my screen and get us going. Okay, how we looking?
Looks perfect. Excellent.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. I have really enjoyed being involved with the Wetland Center and wetlands with all of my colleagues at University of Florida in general over the years. So this is nice to be with all of you all. So I want to start by thanking perennial wetland invaders like purple loosestrife and Phragmites australis and reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinacea. Their considerable degradation of wetland biodiversity inspired this seminar. So as David mentioned, I've got my degrees from around the US, and this kind of inspires my thinking to think kind of nationally about wetland science issues and my research, which is about the transition from invasive species control to native species establishment. These are some of the places I've worked, including invasive Phalaris arundinacea and prairie potholes in the Midwest. More recently, I've been looking at establishing SAV in degraded Florida lakes. So I'm really kind of moving into thinking about this transition from invasive species control to native species establishment, and specifically as it relates to mechanisms and then application of practice. I've also looked at some aggressive plants in Lake Apopka marshes. Here I am in this slide doing just that. Whew, that place gets hot. And then more recently, again, back to the native plants and getting them established in disturbed environments. I've been thinking a lot about how to effectively establish Spartina alterniflora in living shorelines. So that's my research, which kind of dovetails right into my teaching, which I do on a graduate and undergraduate basis here at UF. And I recognize some of the names on the Zoom, some former classmates. So hi, good to see you again. So this is onto my talk. Here's kind of the roadmap of what I'd like to do. I want to tell you about the context of a project I worked on last year. And then I want to go on to give some perspective on invasive plant management in wetlands. And then I'd like to talk about solutions for improving management, specifically two kinds, approaches and actions, and then move on to talking about conclusions for future work and what I really learned from that project. So starting with the motivation, excuse me. So like a lot of researchers in wetland science, and I know you're instructors for this course, I'm really inspired to assist restoration and the management of wetlands with my research. It sounds like this has really been a theme for you all this semester for seminar. There's been a lot of people talking about research and applying it to management. So it sounds like I'm in good company here with these seminar speakers. As far as the motivation for this particular project, I got to talking with some colleagues about wetland plant invasions. And the thing that we all had in common is we teach this stuff to students. And what we realized was the seminal papers on invasive plant management and wetlands are really from like 20 years ago. So there was a Ecology paper in 1999 that looked at invasiveness in wetland plants in temperate North America, and that came out in Wetlands. And then Zedler and Kircher in Critical Reviews had this paper about causes and opportunities of invasive plants and wetlands, and kind of talked more about the mechanisms and the kind of the why of wetland plant invasion. So what we realized was that it had been 20 years since these papers came out, 20 some years, and it seemed like a great opportunity to take stock on what we know, because that is a long time ago. 20 years, a lot has changed. Gas, stamps, world populations. This slide is for the 90s kids. We had SpongeBob SquarePants just came out, and we had Furbies. Jared Leto, boy, he's changed. I think Singles is still my favorite movie though. Will Smith has changed. So yeah, and so has pop music. A lot has changed. Thankfully, we've come a long way. So back to invasive plants. It had been 20 years, so it seemed like a great opportunity to take stock of progress on this front. So the first step we took was to do the symposium at the Society of Wetland Scientists. What we did was we invited people that we thought might have a good perspective on this question. We got some heavy hitters. We got Stephen Travis and Beth Lawrence and Den Larkin and Stephen Knezovic. We got some great people to contribute to this symposium. So it was a good one. The presenters gave their individual perspectives on this question. What do we know and where should we go? And kind of organized their talk around these 10 main questions. And most importantly, maybe at that symposium, what it did was it acknowledged the need for this review. People were like, yes, we really need to revisit kind of progress at this point. So then the next step was that I was planned to go on an incredible international sabbatical with many exciting locations and scientists. It was gonna be amazing. And then pandemic. And so we revised step 2, which ended up being this writing project. So our collaboration turned out to be kind of a scheduled collaborative writing session thing. We used Zotero to pull the literature together. We used Zoom to talk all the time, and we used Google Docs, and we edited regularly and collaboratively and researched collaboratively over Zoom for about a year and a half. And what we did was we made this literature review. We conducted consultations with various colleagues, and we relied on the personal experience of our team, which ended up being 80 years of experience altogether. So we drew on that to really develop this writing project. So I'm showing here, this is our collaborative session. This is what most of this research looks like, actually, is this Google Doc. I'm sure a lot of you can relate. So we worked hard to pull all the literature together. And basically what we kind of came up with was, looking back at both of those papers, we kind of divided things up into these 3 categories. We had your invasion mechanisms, your impacts, and invasion management. Looking back at the Galadowicz paper, that really focused on plant characteristics under mechanisms here. she lined up a lot of the causes for the mechanisms for plant invasion, such as increased genetic diversity, rapid evolution, and phenotypic plasticity. So there are basically outlines of these mechanisms that are related specifically to plant traits. And then while Zedler also talked about important traits for invasiveness, she brought in wetland characteristics and kind of looked at this broader scale issue of why wetlands offer mechanisms for plant invasion. And both of them touched on the impacts of invasive wetland plants, and then really not a lot on management. And so what our group kind of came up with was, if you look left to right here across the slide, we kind of knew a lot about mechanisms. We knew a little bit about impacts, and then management was just like, there was very little connection between management and science. So we decided to start with management as the focus of our review. So the questions are, regarding management, what have we learned and how can we improve? A dip into the literature, the initial dive in showed a few important things. First of all, our efforts commonly fall short. Basically, they fall short of the restoration goals. And that was a number of papers demonstrated that. And then second, there's a lot of good solutions out there in the literature for improving management and doing the most effective research to inform management. And those solutions have been kind of pitched into two categories. The first one are structured approaches that are overarching kind of umbrella approaches and include things like treating the underlying ecological cause of invasion, having that kind of be the approach for attacking the problem. That's sometimes called ecologically based invasive plant management. And then another example idea is to combine iterative experiments with actual restoration simultaneously to enhance learning. And that's commonly referred to as adaptive restoration. So those are some examples of these overall big structured approaches that have been mentioned in the literature as a way to be effective. There was also really a set of distinct specific actions that were emerging for us. So these are distinct things that you can do regardless of where you are in the management program. One example is to not only monitor what happens with the invasive species with your restoration effort, but also monitor what happens with the native plants. It's surprising the degree to which that detail gets overlooked. Also, another key nugget, a good specific action is to improve the usability of the research, to engage in dialogue with practitioners, not just at the start, not just at the end, but throughout the whole process. So there are these structured approaches and these specific actions that emerge from the literature. So the question, though, became, what is the best solution for a particular scenario? Obviously, there's not going to be any one silver bullet. There's not going to be any one solution that's best in every scenario, although a lot of the literature is pitched as if that was the case. So the question is, how do we pick from this kind of menu of solutions to be most effective? And what we realized is that the discussion of solutions in the literature is kind of missing the discussion of the constraints. So what really are the constraints to management? Why are we not achieving those restoration goals? And that is what became the focus of our review, is the constraints and how that links to the solutions. I am happy to say that this was a very successful pandemic writing project, and it ended up getting published in Frontiers. We're really excited about it. And after all those Zoom sessions, something good had to come out of it, right? That's a rhetorical question. Anyway, so that was the result. Now I'm going to tell you about how basically the sausage was made. Our methods really here involved a review of the literature, as I suggested, and we focused and designed our review using this typology from Grant and Booth 2009. This is a great dissection of the different types of reviews if you're not familiar with it. This table goes on for 3 pages, but what I want to point out is they've dissected reviews according to specific characteristics. And now I'm going to make everybody hungry. They divide things up by salsa, their search and their appraisal and the synthesis and the analysis. And so they basically have a topology of all these different types of reviews based on those criteria. We discovered that the state-of-the-art review was the method that we were going to follow. So more about the state-of-the-art review. This is a review that addresses current matters and in a retrospective manner, and then offers new perspectives looking forward. As far as the salsa for our review, the aim is for comprehensive searching of the current literature, and our Zotero library had 3,000 references, so hopefully that goal was achieved. There's no formal quality assessment of the literature other than it's peer-reviewed. We do narrative synthesis, and the analysis is really about developing that current state of knowledge and looking at priorities for the future. What we came up with in our review, or the focus of our review regarding management, was 2 questions. The first one is, what are the constraints? And then the second one is, what are the solutions to improve restoration of invaded wetlands? And so these were discerned from the literature and pulled together to create these broad categories. So first, I'm going to walk you through the constraints. There are scientific and academic constraints. And these might be the ones that, as scientists and those of us in the academic field, we find most intuitive. There's kind of the classic scientific unknown. If only we knew the mechanism of the invasion or what altered competition between the native and the invasive. If we had the key to that scientific unknown, we would know how to effectively manage the system. What might be a little bit less intuitive about using science to improve wetland plant management is that our third bullet here, academic culture and job duties. You know, as faculty members, what our job is to get grants, train students, and write papers. And that may or may not be compatible with the actual process of improving practice. The timelines are different, and there are a variety of reasons why it's difficult for academics to jump into this applied space. Also, use-inspired research funding, the last bullet there, can be scant. Large projects, large pots of money are generally very focused on basic questions in ecology, and it can be limited in terms of looking at applied projects. So there's an example. There's some of the science and academic constraints. There are other constraints, though, that are particularly related to a practitioner viewpoint. So management, institutional, and governance constraints. There are realities that practitioners face every day that prevent them from perhaps advancing wetland plant management, basically related to budgets and infrastructure and a lack of flexibility within their agency. The agency priorities and realities, everything that managers do has to relate back to the mission of their agency, which sometimes makes it difficult to implement strategies in a way that might be different than it has historically. And then management funding can be very challenging if what a manager wants to do is contribute to knowledge to improve invasive plant management in wetlands, because budgets are year to year and unpredictable, and generally all allocated before practitioners have a degree of agency over the money. So kind of separate from academic constraints and practitioner constraints, we've got community stakeholder constraints, and we're defining community stakeholders here as the people who are influenced by invasive plant wetland management, and have attitudes and opinions about it. So community stakeholders can be extremely influential, and there are constraints related to their conflicting attitudes about invaders. It may be that community stakeholders are not interested in having taxpayer money allocated towards control of invasive species. There may be conflict if community stakeholders are not included in the process and their voices are not heard. There may be a limited willingness to cooperate based on values that people hold about certain plants and certain ecosystems. And then lastly, political polarization can really limit constructive dialogue, unfortunately, and then that limits action. So you can see that a lot of these constraints are kind of reflecting a lack of routine translation from science into practice. So this plagues not just wetland plant invasions, but really like a lot of conservation in general. So a lot of this routine lack of translation is kind of summed up in the literature as the implementation gap. This phenomenon has a lot of names. The implementation gap is also called the Great Divide, or the knowledge action gap, or the science practice gap, or the knowing doing gap. Just basically what it summarizes is all of the problems that result when the managers and the scientists and the stakeholders, they operate in separate domains with these kind of fundamentally different constraints that really stymie progress in terms of applying research to practice. So more on the implementation gap, because this really came out of our literature review as being a key barrier to progress. And the question that we begin to ask ourselves is like, why is there this slow progress in overcoming this critical limitation to managing invasive wetland plants? And why can't we just get over this implementation gap? And what we kind of pulled away from the literature is there's the 3 U's of the effort to bridge the implementation gap. First of all, it's generally unassigned. The practitioner's job is resource management. The academic's job is research. And so actually incorporating research advances into management is really not assigned to either party. Actionable science that researchers want to do and science-based decision-making that practitioners want to do both depends on people stepping into this space, but there's no real roadmap for who's responsible for doing that. And then kind of compounding that is that the effort to bridge the implementation gap is unrewarded. Certainly the practitioner is kind of evaluated on the acres restored, acres that they've managed. And then not all, but a lot of academics and faculty and researchers are evaluated on the grants and the papers that they get. So the rewards to stepping into this gap are kind of limited for both parties. And so support getting into these partnerships is complicated unless the upper administration gets on board. And then lastly, evidence suggests that the work that is needed to actually step into this gap is vastly underestimated. Getting into this role requires kind of a profound transition of your job duties. And so it takes a lot of time. We know that there's collaborative efforts take a lot of time. It may be that a practitioner needs to do more monitoring than is already assigned. It may mean that a researcher needs to be involved in a project after the grant budget ends. It's really just kind of, it's a lot more than many people realize, and it can be tough to justify given workloads and the incentives working against you. That being said, a lot of people make this shift, but it's not very well documented in the literature how they do that. So we wanted to look at how to overcome the implementation gap. And what we created was a portfolio of potential solutions. We pulled all of those structured approaches and specific actions out of the literature and connected them to the constraints. And if you want to see the full portfolio, you can check it out in the paper, but I'm just going to highlight parts of the portfolio for you. Let's talk first about the structured approaches that we pulled from the literature. There are some that we pulled that I think are pretty familiar to most people. There's the approach of best management practice. We already know what to do to control that invader, so go on ahead and apply that best practice. Then there's trial and error, which I think is kind of the most, is very promising, and it's definitely appropriate in many strategies, and it is often the way that practitioners operate in the real world. If you try something, it doesn't work, change it. If you tried something that worked, then keep on doing it. So those are kind of the most basic structured approaches. They're limited in complexity and investment, but obviously very high utility in certain scenarios. Then you've got ecologically based invasive plant management and controlled experiments. These approaches are kind of a step-by-step research-based approach to learning more about invasion science and improving management. These take some time. They take a large team of researchers, and it's appropriate. You can definitely learn a lot, and you can publish papers. Then the next three structured approaches we unveiled are knowledge co-production, adaptive management, and adaptive co-management. Now, these approaches involve multi-year cycles. For knowledge co-production, you're developing usable knowledge through an iterative process of working with practitioners over a period of years. Knowledge co-production, in a sense, begins and never ends. It's just practitioners and managers working together on a single project, which is great if you can find the funding to stay focused on that particular ecosystem and working with that single set of managers. Then there's adaptive management, which is systematically comparing competing models of the effectiveness of multiple actions. And then the models get updated in this iterative cycle as we collect more data. And there's a cycle of implementation and monitoring and learning that is institutionally heavy. We need a lot of support to do this kind of a thing. And it takes a long time, and you learn a lot, and it ends up being highly usable. Now, adaptive co-management is like adaptive management, but it involves getting those stakeholders involved. So it has the potential to be even highly more effective. But you can see as we're moving up on our arrow on the side here, we're getting into increasing complexity and investment. And so our contribution when we look at all these structured approaches is not necessarily to pick one over the other, but to point out that there are these set of approaches, and each of them can be applicable in their own situation. So we also pulled from the literature basically what the parameters are that you should be looking for to select your structured approach. For instance, if your management urgency is high, then it makes sense to get in there and do something quickly in order to continue to involve your stakeholders in the process. So applying a best management practice or using trial and error is really going to be most effective. There are cases in which adaptive management and adaptive co-management are relevant, because if your management urgency is high, then there's going to be a lot of support for your project. And so it's likely that you'll get the resources to implement those kinds of approaches. But something like controlled experiments, if the management urgency is high, is probably not going to be the best solution. So there are other contexts in which they are all different, but I'll refer you to the full portfolio in the article to go over all of them. So specific actions. Remember, we talked about how the solutions broke out into not only those structured approaches, those big umbrella approaches, but also specific actions. We unveiled 36 specific actions that kept coming up in the literature again and again as being important, effective, and useful. And so what we did was we grouped them by category. Here was a big category, was improving the exchange of knowledge and ideas between scientists and practitioners. Those suite of specific actions included things like using cooperative extension to unite scientists and practitioners. While for commodity-based extension, this is a very common approach. For many natural sciences, cooperative extension is highly underutilized. Also, where cooperative extension has been utilized, I'll use Florida Sea Grant as an example. It's been very effective. Another way to improve exchange was to increase practitioner access to journals. This one came up in many papers, and still that paywall remains a challenge. There are ways to get information to practitioners, though, that might even be better than access to journals, including when researchers distill their research into timely, clear summaries. Yes, as little as a paragraph. It's hard to do, but it's a very effective way of improving exchange. Conducting demonstration research projects was very effective in improving the exchange of knowledge. Wherever there is an opportunity, as in the funding, the site, and willing managers and willing researchers, these demonstration projects really garnered a lot of exchange of knowledge and ideas and helped move things forward much more so than just controlled experiments. And then lastly, field tours, workshops, working groups, and webinars were all really valuable to actually facilitating those conversations between researchers and practitioners that were really important. Just as we're looking at these actions, specific actions to be taken, I'm going to refer you back to one of our earlier conclusions that stepping into this space to actually improve exchange of knowledge and ideas is going to be a time commitment and heavy kind of a situation. Another suite of specific actions that I wanted to call your attention to is cash, of course. Strategically allocating cash for invader research and management can go a long way towards advancing our overall goals here. Communicating the urgency to increase funding is a really important thing to do. Also allocating funding to the sites that need it the most, and also based on organizational capacity. What was really interesting was that we saw that the variation in organizations that were put in charge of restoration projects really had a lot to do with whether or not they reached the goal. So making sure that the organizational capacity matches what the project needs is really important. Hiring a project coordinator, either as a practitioner or a scientist, did a lot to ensure a return on investments for large projects. These are positions that are usually not well planned for, but they have a huge impact when they are present, suggesting that we should really be using coordinators and professional ones more often. And then teams of scientists and practitioners to broaden the availability of funding sources was another important way to a specific action to increase funding. So again, the portfolio goes over a number of different suites of specific actions that you can see in the document itself. So at the end, we've got these structured approaches, and we have those specific actions, and that brought us to the meat of the paper, which was linking them to those constraints that we originally identified. So this is the portfolio itself. Given that I have certain constraints, which structured approaches and specific actions make the most sense? So I'll give you an example of how this works. If your major constraint is that you don't have enough training to do use-inspired research, there are several specific actions that can be taken. Demonstration projects can be great because that can help you gain that on-the-job training that you need to do use-inspired research. All of those suite of idea exchange specific actions that were mentioned earlier are helpful. And then also having scientists get trained in management. Often we talk about how practitioners need to be trained in science in order to create these conversations, but having scientists trained in management and getting familiar with the constraints that they face is also really important. Also, we identified what structured approaches are appropriate for those constraints. So you can see here that knowledge co-production, adaptive management, and adaptive co-management are all linked to trying to overcome this constraint of use-inspired research. And then if we look at a management constraint, or agency jurisdictions, this is the constraint by which the agency itself limits progress in terms of improving management. Ways to address this constraint include pooling resources with academics and practitioners, looking at shared motivations and highlighting them through the use of teams, and then also using cooperative weed management areas, which are doing a lot to overcome constraints related to agency jurisdictions. And then again, that coordinator can be really important for those kinds of situations where agency jurisdictions form the biggest constraint. Notice that when you have agency jurisdiction constraints, really the only umbrella approach that's going to help overcome that constraint is adaptive co-management that involves stakeholders. So it's this kind of linkages that emerged from our literature review that helped us kind of pigeonhole which structured approaches and specific actions are appropriate given the constraints. And again, community stakeholder constraints being a common constraint. Notice that there really is just one suite of community stakeholder constraints that can be overcome with, there's only one set of specific actions that address community stakeholder constraints and those that are involved stakeholders. So public meetings, the professional facilitator, citizen scientists, and using university capacity for engagement. So all of that, those type of specific actions are going to be relevant for stakeholder engagement realities. So again, the whole system is available in the paper, but I'll distill our conclusions for you. And on this page, on this slide, this is a reminder for me to acknowledge all the practitioners that I worked with for 6 years in the upper Midwest on an adaptive management project that helped me kind of build foundational knowledge to work on future projects that are applied research. But the conclusions from our writing project are, really retrospectively, we thought that if we knew everything we could about mechanisms that we could predict management outcomes, and therefore it made a lot of sense to initially invest a lot in research to determine mechanisms. However, there are these social, institutional, and governance constraints that interfere even when the outcome and the mechanism can predict the outcome. So to kind of get around that, we link constraints to solutions to be effective. And if you start with an honest assessment of the most relevant constraints to your particular situation, then that's what's going to be what's necessary to help identify the solutions that are going to be the most effective. And then lastly, just to kind of justify all the work that went into pulling this stuff from the literature, wetland conservation itself kind of lags behind other ecosystems simply because wetlands occur in positions in the landscape that are commonly developed. So because wetland conservation lags, we've got this reliance on restoration. What this means is restoration is commonly limited by invasive plants. So it makes sense for us to invest in knowing the best ways to control invasive plants. And then lastly, looking at the conclusions from many articles, what we kind of a takeaway looking forward is that although progress has been relatively slow in improving management over the past few decades, progress is still progress. And failing to reach goals doesn't justify abandoning efforts. And so doing things like this analysis to try to make sure that our efforts are placed most effectively are really important to reaching our overall goals of providing the ecosystem functions and services that wetlands provide. So that's all I have to say about the many, many years of work on this project.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Adams, virtual or otherwise. Let's see, move that. And we will go to the room first for any questions. I'll check here over on YouTube, see if we've got anything. But you can unmute and ask a question if you have one.
Can I pitch in here? This is Kathy.
Absolutely.
Carrie, can you tell us if there are any shining examples of where you could see that things went from one step to the other smoothly or eventually?
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, there are when there are definitely those examples, and where they were documented in the literature, it was really inspiring to read. For instance, Joy Zedler's involvement with the Sweetwater Mitigation Project in San Diego. That is very well documented in the literature, and you can see exactly how her collaboration with the California Department of Transportation, it really helped them restore and learn at the same time. Another good example, figures, it's both of our co-authors of our seminal papers, Sue Galatowicz's Spring Peeper Meadow restoration in Minnesota, in which she collaborated with the Department of Environmental Protection to, over a few years, restore a wetland that was dominated by reed canary grass that's kind of in the heart of the Twin Cities, that is visited by practitioners and scientists routinely, and their lessons are clearly displayed there at the wetland and also well published in the literature. And so that's probably two examples that stick out of examples that we can follow to see exactly how this is done. Unfortunately, a lot of the case studies that showed successful evolution and improving management didn't really detail exactly how things happened. For instance, often in the literature, it would say there was an initial coordination meeting to start the project, but things like an agenda, attendees, how long the meeting was, what the objectives of the meeting were, these were all missing from the literature. So we saw that as a big hole in terms of, yeah, it's being done clearly, but it is not documented well in peer-reviewed literature, which is where a lot of scientists are looking for it, to make advancements themselves.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so you mentioned these two examples that worked well and both had an agency involved. You said California DOT and then like the
Minnesota Department of Environmental Protection.
Yeah, and so I think in your review, were there any attributes of the agency partners? I think of like when we work with the National Wildlife Refuge or something. They don't have a budget for science, but they have a real strong interest in science. Whereas maybe DOTs sometimes don't. In the case of that you shared, they did. So our USGS, of course, has like adaptive management. Army Corps has adaptive management. They call it something else. But so did you find any attributes of the agency partners that sort of predict federal, state, local, or like when are you going to get a success out of an agency? Or does it come down to the person, the people?
Yeah, nice foreshadowing. So yes, there are agency characteristics that pointed out that these agencies kind of emerged as being extremely effective. And those were agencies where the commitment to stepping into the implementation gap was at the highest level. So what emerged from a few papers is that even if you have overcommitted individuals that are single-mindedly interested in stepping into the gap, if they are at lower levels of the agency, then it's not really that effective. I'm thinking of, and there were anecdotal observations too of such things. For instance, a practitioner who wanted to help on an adaptive management project, but the monitoring exceeded, he had other routine monitoring that he needed to do. And then the adaptive management monitoring he needed to do, he had to wear a headlight headlamp and do it in the middle of the night, which, you wonder about the data quality there. But anyway, the point is it couldn't fit during his regular job duties. And so even though he was overcommitted, because those in charge of him were not, he couldn't really be effective. But then also another thing that emerged that didn't have as much to do with the organization was just these highly committed individuals that emerge from different levels of organizations that are needed to pull things off. And at every instance where things were very successful, there was absolutely individuals who were going up outside of their job description and committing time and hours outside of what they were required to do and recognized to do. So these key individuals.
Thanks. Marge,
I wish
do
it
you have
wasn't
one?
that way, but it is.
Yeah. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
Carrie, my question was going to be similar to Kathy's regarding success stories, and it sounded like you identified some, but it's a really great effort to try to pull all this complexity together and try to show a path forward for practitioners or anybody basically in the realm of restoration science. My curiosity at this point is the literature review is kind of like an observation. You've created structure around it. How do you test now whether or not that is a effective way forward? And I don't know how you do that, because in part you've identified evidence of successes that have happened, but in the sense of, okay, that's the hypothesis. Now, how do we test this approach as a successful way? And maybe certain things, need tweaking or whatever. So where do you go from here, I guess, is the next step or question.
Yeah, that is a great question. What I can tell you is that since we completed that paper, my colleagues and I we're working on the mechanisms paper, which is going to be great, I'm sure. But in our conversations, all of us have started new projects with using our framework. And so far, picking the specific actions has been super useful. But the challenge is, you're really describing the challenge well. What we have thought of is doing a workshop to kind of follow up with participants from our original symposium to talk to them to get ideas about how to actually implement the solutions that have emerged from the literature review. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about it too, because it would be cool to be able to test it.
Well, what would be nice too is to try to move it into the non-academic realm, the true manager's realm, as a tool to, find their way as to, do we need more information? Do we apply what we have? Which is always the case of the situation. Either way, it's just an interesting situation where you make these observations, you develop this great potential response, but now how do you vet that to make sure that that's actually going to be the optimal way forward? But yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true. And we've been also using it in classes and pitching it to students who come up with some good ideas about how to test things too. So hopefully we'll bring that all together. You're right. That's absolutely the next step.
Either way, thank you again. Great job.
Thanks.
Our YouTube crowd is pretty quiet. So any last questions from the room in here? Well, Carrie, I'll just ask you one last one, which of course, I know, you talk about like the value. When you get to the stakeholders, they all have different values, and some are from Nature Conservancy and have a strong dedication to native plant communities, for example. And some maybe sort of see benefits of, a different having less fidelity or not spending time or in money invested so much in the fidelity of a historic ecosystem. So Can you tell us maybe just like one story of someone who was like, screw this, just let's let them go. I mean, it's invasive, they're invasive. Let's let them go. I mean, I'm sure you encountered a lot of opinions, and including something along that line. So you have a story for us about that?
Yeah, let me think about that. A situation where the fidelity was maybe not necessarily
where maybe a natural resources stakeholder didn't really place the same priority that, your first slide, right, about these invasives as a motivator for understanding how much these ecosystems have changed. And of course, they are changing in the lifetimes of observers and users. So or maybe you didn't. Maybe everyone you talked to was like, yeah, we're going to get rid of these invasives. That's the whole
No,
point of why they even
of
came
course
to your
not.
team.
Yeah, no, I got a good example for you. I mean, I've got many, but I am thinking of one that I can talk about without incriminating anybody, I think. Anyway, so reed canary grass in the upper Midwest, it replaces a diverse prairie pothole ecosystem. So like, 40, 50 herbaceous species are just mowed over by this reed canary grass. And so people at the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited are very interested in removing the reed canary grass and promoting native species, which happen to be the historical context,
Right.
the reference ecosystem, the original ecosystem. Fish and Wildlife Service, however, they are interested not only in plant communities, but also in wildlife communities. And their primary mission, of course, being to conserve threatened and endangered species. The Massasauga rattlesnake is a major concern for Fish and Wildlife Service in the upper Midwest, and they do just fine in reed canary grass. In fact, further complicating the matter, a lot of the methods that are most effective for treating reed canary grass, such as using tractors to apply herbicide and burning and mowing, cause a lot of Massasauga rattlesnake mortality. And so in the upper Midwest, there's a struggle, and further, the rattlesnakes are important to one region of Fish and Wildlife, but not the other. And so there's a lot of conflict. And one thing that they're trying is to partition the landscape and set aside areas where we're just going to let the reed canary grass go. The rattlesnakes will have their day, and then we'll focus management in other areas. So.
All right. Well, that's a great example for all the students out there, just to think if it was already not hard enough to even do something about the knowledge gap or the implementation gap, then you also have like what's the right decision gap. So thank you so much, Carrie. It was great to have you.
Amanda's got a question.
Oh, sorry. Please go ahead. Yeah.
No, you're good. The main thing, I'm just like, this entire presentation, my head's been screaming seed source, and then kind of just like what you just brought up, the fact, okay, so we're going to leave a perfect area of this grass that will provide a seed source for what you're trying to restore. And I think like, from my practitioner background, that's what we ran into all the time. Everyone was so focused on, hydrology, get it. If you get the hydrology right for, wetlands in particular, I guess, you've got it. Like you can, really bring back a system, or, whether you're doing restoration or mitigation, but then we would always have continuous, we only have a few acres that we get to restore, and then we have seed sources right on the other side of the road that was either coming, by wind or water. And, of course, in most situations, nobody's going to pay for restoration efforts beyond, or management efforts, I guess, beyond, 5 years or so. So I guess, like, where do we go from there? And what are your thoughts on that? Like, is that where we get more stakeholders involved? And
wow, I think about this a lot too, Amanda, because the kind of the approaches that we take and the methods that we use to control invasive species and restore ecosystems in the literature are bounded, right? You think about the boundaries that are then subject to, as you mentioned, off-source influences such as potential dispersal of invasive species into a restoration site. We uncovered many examples where there were major issues with boundaries and things, management objectives and stakeholder groups being different on either side of the boundary. And for those kinds of constraints, what we ended up linking those to were the kind of approaches that increased dialogue. And this is where the professional facilitator came in, we unearthed many papers where you could tell that had the professional the evidence was there, had the professional facilitator not been involved in trying to get groups to come to a consensus, there would have been very limited progress in terms of treating an invasion. And so the professional facilitators is one bright spot, I would say, in that seemingly intractable challenge and constraint of working across areas where people have different objectives.
All right, thank you. So we're a little over, so let's give one more round of applause to Dr. Adams. Thank you so much for finishing up strong, our semester strong. I'll pop into the chat the evaluations again. For all the students, please do the evals. We appreciate you, and hopefully we will see you all next semester, whether you register for a credit or will just tune in on YouTube or in the Zoom. It's great to see you all here.